Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way.
Welcome, everyone, to the Mindful Healers podcast. Our episode today is on self-compassion with special guest Dr. Stephen Hickman. Our intention for today is, in addition, to remind you that this podcast should not be construed as medical advice, and that for the specifics of the podcast with our special guest, Dr. Hickman, we're hoping to provide some helpful insights on why self-compassion is so important and hopefully to inspire you to include this important skill in your own self-care routine. We hope that you'll discover that self-compassion lends itself to even more compassion to be able to share with others. And some of the takeaways that we hope you'll get will be in-the-moment ways to practice self-compassion, particularly when you are encountering difficulty, stress, and discomfort. A very warm welcome to our special guest, Dr. Stephen Hickman, psychologist, internationally renowned mindfulness and mindful self-compassion teacher and leader, and now author of his new book, SelfCompassion for Dummies, that we'll be talking about today. Steve is the founding executive director of the UC San Diego Center for Mindfulness and is the executive director of the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion and one of my first mindfulness teacher mentors and a dear friend. Welcome, Steve, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here with you.
Can you tell us your story with how mindfulness and self-compassion have become such large chunks of your life?
Yeah, I would like to be able to say it was all part of a master plan that I laid out in advance, but that's not the way it went. But the source of all of it really probably was in my role at UC San Diego as a psychologist when I was working with our chronic pain clinic and sitting with people with incredible challenges and chronic pain of various sorts. And ultimately had this opportunity to learn that mindfulness, the capacity to be in the present moment non-judgmentally, could really be a powerful source of relief of the suffering that I was witness to. There are a lot more details to how this all unfolded, but being witness to that suffering and discovering that mindfulness could somehow relieve that suffering, and not just theoretically, but I could see it happen as I taught it to those folks, really is the essence of the whole journey. Began there and has unfolded over time. I taught mindfulness in the form of mindfulness-based stress reduction for many years at UC San Diego, and then discovered mindful self-compassion. And it was brought to me by a colleague, a mutual colleague of ours, Michelle Becker, who had gone to a training with Chris Germer and Kristin Neff, who were the founders of the program, both leaders in the field of contemplative practice and self-compassion in particular. She came back from a training and said, "Oh, I just went to this amazing training in this brand new program, Mindful Self-Compassion. Chris and Kristin just really wanted me to be the very first teacher of the program other than themselves." And we got together and we kind of planned out a strategy that involves you. And so we wanted to know if you would be on board with us. And I was quite skeptical. The strategy was that she wanted to teach the program at UC San Diego, which I said, well, okay. I was somewhat reluctant because I thought my belief was mindfulness would hold everything, that we could contend with the stress, pain, and illness of life through the practice of mindfulness, which isn't untrue, but it's a little more complex than that. And I sort of saw this as, well, do we really need this? But yeah, go ahead. If you want to teach it, you can. And then she said, well, there's a bit of a catch. The catch is that this program really should be co-taught. And we all thought it would be a nice idea if you would be my co-teacher. And she knew that I have an inability to say no to things, which has gotten me a lot of places, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. But all in all, in the end, I did end up teaching the program with her and just loved it on beyond what I had been doing with mindfulness. And the essence of it, of why I'm really now focused on self-compassion, was to see people who had learned something about mindfulness and then came to this mindful self-compassion course, and something else qualitatively happened for them. They melted, they bloomed. I don't know how to describe it. They talked more, they cried more, they were more expressive. And it isn't to say that what they learned in mindfulness wasn't helpful, but in talking with them, what I found was that when they started to become more mindful and aware of their inner process, they also noticed, in many cases, a horrendous inner critic, an inner commentary or voice that drove them, that was perfectionistic, that was shame-based, that beat them up at every turn. Every time there was something went badly, there was a voice right there to tell them, why they weren't any good and why they didn't have any business doing whatever they were doing. And they're not smart enough, they're not pretty enough, they're not talented enough, whatever it is. And they didn't know what to do with that in mindfulness. They knew that they could kind of white knuckle it, they could tolerate it, kind of grit their teeth and bear it. But what they learned in the practice of self-compassion was that they could actually, in addition to all of that, just meet themselves with kindness because of the fact that this was going on, that they were struggling and suffering. And it was okay to treat themselves the same way they would treat a good friend, with kindness, with patience, not try to get rid of it or change it, but just to meet themselves in the middle of a difficult situation. The way, anyone in a helping profession like medicine will meet people in the midst of their own medical suffering, sometimes with the ability to change the condition, but many times without that capability. Did you meet yourself that same way? The same way you'd meet your child who has the flu and give them a cold compress or give them a hug or say sweet things to them, not because you think you're treating their flu, but because they're human and they're struggling. Could we actually treat ourselves that same way when we suffer? So that was a long answer to a short question.
So speaking about suffering and the suffering that we're witnessing at, I'd like to say, unprecedented levels right now, there is a lot of empathy fatigue that's been felt, especially on the part of healthcare professionals during the pandemic. And so let's jump right in. What is empathy and what is compassion?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and those two get lumped together, and I think they are very different things. And sometimes you also hear this very confusing term, compassion fatigue, which is actually a misnomer. So I'll touch on that too. So if you start with the definition of compassion, which is in various forms, essentially the deep awareness of the presence of suffering coupled with the desire to relieve that suffering. That's really like the essence of compassion. And you can't have compassion with just one of those elements and not the other. You have to feel it to heal it, as they say, but you also have to have the wish to relieve it. So empathy is really the first half of the equation. It's the feeling the pain of another person. And there's all kinds of conversations and discussions and research around how that is that we are able to sense the suffering of another person. We don't have to get into that necessarily, except to say that physiologically, neurologically, something is going on when we encounter the suffering of another person. And that's not rocket science. You know that. Everyone listening to this knows that when they've been in the presence of people suffering, you feel their suffering. It isn't just that you know that they're suffering, you can feel it. So however that mechanism works, the idea is that if you feel it, that's the empathy. You can feel the pain of another person. It's a one-way street. It comes just in. But just by itself, if that's it, if you're just feeling pain all the time, you can't tolerate that. I mean, nobody can. So it's like people have always, friends of mine, when I became a psychologist, like to say, I don't know how you can be a psychologist when I used to do psychotherapy. All you do is you sit and you listen to people's problems all day long, and all they just tell you everything is how horrible it is and everything. Like, I could never do that. And I thought, well, geez, I could never do that either if that's all I was doing, just sitting there soaking up like a sponge all of the suffering of another person. That's the empathy. But what makes it a rewarding profession to be a doctor or a psychologist or a helper of any sort is that you can feel that and then hold it in a larger space of awareness where we can attempt to relieve that suffering or wish to relieve the suffering in some way. So the empathy is the one-way street. It's a fire hose these days, especially in your profession for sure, when it's just all coming at you. But the good news is that if you can cultivate the capacity to not only feel that, because you're going to, but also hold it in that space where you actually can connect to the wish to relieve it, even if it's only by your presence and nothing else, much less any sort of intervention, then you start to be able to actually function in that environment and still be a kind, compassionate physician or healthcare professional of any sort, if you can couple this empathy with the wish to relieve that pain and suffering. Now, that's all sort of theoretical, and it's not exactly practical, but that is the essence of it. And really part of it is, can you take care of yourself and your needs and meet your own struggles over being overwhelmed or whatever in the midst of the work? So, everyone will give you lots of advice. If you're suffering burnout, they'll tell you, here's what you need to do. You set better boundaries, go on vacation, get a massage, take a break, whatever it is. But if you're there with a patient who's suffering and you're needed, you are not in a position to say, you know what? Everything's going on right now is kind of freaking me out. So I'm going to take a break. I'm going to step out. I'm going to take a moment for myself. I'm going to go get a massage and I'll be back, right? We can't do that. So what we have to be able to do is to learn how to breathe underwater, how to be able to be kind to ourselves in the midst of these moments in little ways that help to feed us and foster that wish to relieve that suffering that goes with the feeling of their suffering as well. And that's where self-compassion comes in.
And so leading into that, then what specifically is self-compassion?
So if, as I said, with the compassion, we have this idea that it's the ability to be aware of suffering and have the wish to relieve it. And so self-compassion is really only compassion turned inward. It's a U-turn. There's nothing different between self-compassion and compassion for others. Kristin Neff, who's the leading researcher of self-compassion and the co-founder of Mindful Self-Compassion, has identified that there are basically three factors, three components of self-compassion that need to be present for this to occur. So the first thing is mindfulness. So we've already sort of touched on that. We have to be aware that we are suffering. And you'd think that would be an easy one. But actually, intellectually, we could say, yes, I know I am suffering or I was suffering. But in the moment, we're often too tuned into the other person, especially when you're in a healthcare profession. There's no time for you, right? There's like the patient who's suffering, who's screaming, who's writhing, who's, whatever, having symptoms. So in those moments of encountering another person's suffering, it's actually noticing that you too are suffering in some way. Now, hopefully you're not dissolving in a puddle on the floor or running away from things, but you are suffering. So to have self-compassion in that moment, you have to at least make room for the reality that is your own experience. So that's the mindfulness component of it. But more than that, there's also recognizing that if you're feeling pain, struggle, suffering of another person, if you are struggling in some way, that's actually part of being human. And this is what we would call common humanity, the second component of self-compassion, the recognition that we all struggle and suffer. That if you're feeling sad, you are with a few billion other human beings that are in that moment are feeling sad because it's a part of the human experience. if you're wishing you could do more, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're angry, upset, sad, whatever it is, this is not a sign of some weakness on your part, but a sign that you are actually a human being and that everybody suffers at times. So you're not alone, because usually where we tend towards seeing ourselves as isolated and separate from others rather than really quite similar. And we know, genetically we're 99.999% the same. But we forget all of that in moments of struggle, and suddenly we think we are unique on the planet. So that's the that's the common humanity piece. And then the third part, so once you've noticed this presence of suffering, you recognize it's a part of the human condition, then you can connect with your wish to be kind in that moment. And this is the self-kindness piece. What we most often identify with self-compassion is the kindness part of it, because it's the sort of end result of the process. But so we need those things together. We need to be aware that there's suffering present. So we need to be mindful, which is not as easy as it sounds, as you know. We're often not in the present moment. We need to be aware that we are a member of the human race and share a common humanity, and we are not uniquely sad, isolated, flawed, imperfect, because we're all that. And then we can connect with that part of us that would like it to be different and would wish kindness or bring kindness to the situation. And kindness is not what comes up for us when we're suffering. As I mentioned, quite often for a lot of us, what comes up if we feel bad is some form of perfectionism or some kind of self-criticism, the opposite of self-kindness, basically. So it's not an easy thing to do, but you can bring them all together, mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness in those moments of when we are suffering. That actually gives us strength and resilience. And there's plenty of research behind this, that people who are more self-compassionate do tend to be more resilient. They're able to, handle more difficulties, all kinds of things that are actually contrary to what most people first think about self-compassion, because self-compassion might sound like self-care or self-indulgence or narcissism or weakness of some sort, when in fact it's actually the opposite.
And with the heightened levels of stress, in part because of the COVID-19 Delta variant that's rampaging through the United States right now, also there's been a mixture of different interpretations of masking and vaccine recommendations. A lot of difficult emotions are arising in us as healers. A lot of moral injury has been happening. And so how can we use mindful self-compassion to help us move through the difficulty, especially when we're in that midst of experiencing those difficult emotions?
Yeah, I think, that's a complex question, of course. And at the essence of this, hopefully this has sort of come through in what I've said, is this capacity to meet ourselves when we are upset, uncomfortable, angry, outraged, morally injured, whatever it may be, to actually just allow these things to be here when they're here, because they're here anyway. And that's sort of nice in the general sort of way, but it's a very specific thing, because it's very easy to fall into this mode, as I'm sure you and the listeners are aware of the us versus them kind of a thing, or like, I know what's right and these people don't. And there's like, that whole separation, that tribalism that's like rampant in our culture right now. And it's separating. And not only it separates us, it alienates both sides. It's not productive at all, but I totally understand it. And I buy into it as much as anybody does when I'm not paying attention. And so when we can encounter people and really see them for what they are as human beings, fellow human beings who also struggle and suffer and just want to be happy and free from suffering. And the only thing that allows us to do that is to meet ourselves kindly and to say, wow, this is hard. I'm frustrated. And to own that, so that you can be a little bit vulnerable and open to the other person and their perspective, not because they're right or because of anything else, but just because they're another human being who's struggling. And I'm saying all this because I had a very interesting conversation with a very close family member over the weekend who had resisted up until a week ago getting the vaccination. This is somebody who I love dearly and who is an intelligent person otherwise, well, even in all ways, but for whatever reason, just didn't go through. And I had the opportunity to ask this person, like, what tipped the scale? What was going on for you in the first place? Because I didn't really quiz him previously. And I could, because I love him, could sit across the table from him and just listen to him. And when he could articulate what his thought process was, it wasn't defensive. It was fear, something nobody likes to admit. He was willing to be vulnerable with me, maybe more than other people. But I could really actually sort of have some kind of empathy with him. I mean, of course, I was happy because he'd gotten the first vaccine. So I got from him what I wanted, but really it was being able to just see that this other person who has made this choice has done it not out of trying to offend me. I don't need to take it personally. It's unfortunate and it's sad. And could I just be sad for him, or if he still hadn't done that, and to hear, just to give him a place to say what he needed to say. So I don't know if that's really helpful necessarily, but so many things would be so much better if we could just look people in the eye and see that this is another human being who just wants to be happy and free from suffering. Absolutely everyone on the planet. It doesn't mean everyone on the planet goes about it in the best possible way. And some people have some very twisted ways of going about it. But I swear that that's the resolution of this, is to see not like groups of people with a certain color flag or a certain candidate they love or a certain political view, but just humans who are just trying to muddle through. I think that's, I mean, it may sound really naive and I don't know what, but that's just, to me, that's the key to this. So being able to see that one person in front of us as a fellow human being that just wants to be happy and free from suffering seems like cure a lot of things.
So like grounding into the common humanity piece and not forgetting that that there's a tendency for an us versus them mentality in a survival instinct type way, that of course we resort to that type of tactic when there's fear involved and when there's anxiety and stress. But thank you for that crucial reminder of tapping into, yes, we are all just but a speck in this grand universe, and we are all humans just trying to do the best that we possibly can in light of the chaos that is happening.
And we have survived because we are, herd animals, so to speak. That's probably not the nicest way to describe us, but we need each other. It's not just like a cute bumper sticker or whatever. We literally are born needing, care, and we live our whole lives needing the care and connection with other people. And we feel that connection and we thrive in that connection. And the suffering comes when there's disconnection. And kind of along that lines, because we are wired to be social beings, to support each other, and which means that we also kind of like tend to huddle around and go tribal when we're afraid, because that's what you do. You circle the wagon, so to speak. You get your herd together, and together you can protect yourselves, but it's not really healthy in the long run. But because we have the ability to attune to other people, because that's innate in us for survival, it poses a particular challenge for us in the helping professions, because we're especially attuned to the pain and struggle of other people. And so that one of the keys with self-compassion is helping to sort of recognize that, but also recognize the limits of what we can do in the midst of that relationship, and to sort of be able to carve out what's mine, what can I contribute to this, and where do I have to let go? It's like the serenity prayer from Alcoholics Anonymous. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's sort of the key for people in helping professions, especially with the demands you have right now being able to sort that out. What is it that is mine to do, and what is it that is not mine that I have to let go of?
And did you want to share with our listeners
Yeah.
a similar phrase that's taught in MSc?
Yeah. So we have a practice that we call compassion with equanimity, and those are two big words, and don't have to get hung up on that. But really, it's a practice of reminding ourselves of those things. And so we build this into a meditation that starts with everyone is on their own life journey. So just recognizing that each of us is unique, and we're traveling along, and we have our unique histories. So everyone is on their own life journey. I am not the cause of this person's suffering, nor is it entirely within my power to make it go away, even though I wish I could. So just recognizing that, that I'm not the cause of this person's suffering, and it's not entirely within my power to make it go away, even though I wish that to be true. So just beginning to recognize the limits of our capacity. And then moments like this can be difficult to bear, and I may still try to help if I can. So again, contributing what one can contribute, but not feeling an obligation or a responsibility to relieve all of that person's suffering, because you didn't make it in the first place. How would you be able to take on the suffering of the world? You can do what you can do, and you want to be able to be free to do as much as you possibly can, but understand your limits, which is, again, easy to say, hard to do. So just to kind of reiterate, everyone is on their own life journey. I'm not the cause of this person's suffering, nor is it entirely within my power to make it go away, even though I wish I could. And moments like this can be difficult to bear, yet I may still try to help if I can. It's really a nice way of finding that balance, or what we would call equanimity, in the face of these kinds of challenges. It's not disconnecting, it's actually connecting to what's actually happening. Sometimes people will use mindfulness as a means of sort of disconnecting or kind of separating. That's not in the intention, but that's what happens sometimes. Mindfulness is actually a warm, compassionate practice that means tending to what's actually here, just what's here, not taking it off into the future and the past, seeing the reality of the situation. So people will often think of mindfulness and meditation and all these things as sort of ways of getting away from the present moment in some capacity, but it's really being fully immersed in the present moment and just the present moment. So
that statement is so poignant and so true. And as healthcare professionals, there's this tendency to get into that fixing mentality and solving mentality. And the statement just rings so true that we have to kind of absolve ourselves and remind ourselves that, of course, we're going to do the best that we can for this person who's suffering in front of us. And yet recognizing at the same time that there are limitations in terms of not being able to necessarily completely take away this person's suffering, and that's okay.
Yeah, there's this cute saying that people who practice mindfulness often will say, pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. And that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But recognizing the difference between pain and suffering, especially for someone like me in the mental health field, where I was seeing people with chronic pain, there was very little I could do for their physical pain, if you can even divide it, because you look at pain in the brain and it's not like, you have pain in your neck and so there's a spot in your brain that lights up and that's it. It's a complex experience. And if one can have a sensation of pain but be less distressed by it, that's an improvement. That's treatment, right? That's reducing the symptoms. If the person says they're a 6 on the 1 to 10 scale instead of an 8, that's progress. That's something pretty valuable. And most people who have an 8 would be very happy to have a 6, happier to have a 4 or a 2 or whatever, but you do what you can do. And if you can do that without simultaneously being overwhelmed by the fact that you can't make it a 0, you're going to have a hard time. So it's just finding what is, like I said, I guess, what is yours to do, what is possible, and then putting all of your resources into that. Again, easier said than done, like all of this stuff.
Are there any other in the moment tips that you'd like to share with our listeners to apply right away with regards to mindful self-compassion?
So I have a little longer practice that I can introduce maybe at the end, but there is a lot to be said for, like, when if you're sitting here listening to this, in the moment, you're probably not particularly overly stressed, or at least not, there are no demands on you immediately. You have things to do, and maybe this is a break between busy things. But when you're relaxed, when your sympathetic nervous system is not on alert for danger, all of this sounds really good. And you say, yes, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be kinder to myself. And then, all hell breaks loose and it goes out the window. Usually because you're not mindful. So really the mindfulness is still the foundation. So finding a way to find your way back into the present moment so that you can actually kind of like see things as they actually are is super important. It's why this is like the shortest mindfulness practice. I don't remember who taught it to me, but I've taught it to a zillion people when I saw patients in the emergency room who were anxious. I would say, we've just been talking. I've been asking you about your situation and what brings you into the hospital. And over the course of our conversation, I've not done anything other than to talk with you and ask you to describe what's going on. And look, you appear to be a little less anxious. You seem to be a little more calm. I mean, nothing else has changed, but you seem like you're feeling, yeah, maybe I am feeling a little bit better. I said, well, I didn't do anything to you. I didn't inject you with Ativan. I didn't hypnotize you. I didn't do anything. Except to bring you to the present moment. So maybe being in the present moment might have some value. So I would suggest one thing that will help you is in a moment of distress, of overwhelm, of anxiety, you ask yourself a really dumb question. Where are my feet? It's a silly enough question, you'll remember it even when you're upset. And in that moment of mindfulness, which is what that is, you can suddenly stop and see everything clearly for a moment. And in that moment, then you might be able to say, you might be able to ask yourself the fundamental question of self-compassion, which I haven't said so far. So the fundamental question of self-compassion is asking yourself in a moment, what do I need? In this very moment, given everything that's here, what do I need to maybe feel just a little bit acknowledged, to be a little bit present, to be a little bit kind? What do I need? Do I need to step out? Do I need to just breathe? Do I need to put my hand on my heart and comfort myself just a little bit? What do I need? And if you could just remember that one simple question, well, two questions. Where are my feet? And what do I need? One or both will be helpful.
And in getting to the end of our podcast episode, those are wonderful segues into the reflection questions that we usually end our episodes with. So in addition to where are my feet and what do I need, thinking back to the totality of this episode for our dear listeners, what does self-compassion then look like for you? And which of these tips, these rich tips that Steve just shared with us, and also many more in his book, Self-Compassion for Dummies, which of these tips just shared resonate with you that you might want to try to incorporate? And Steve, thank you so much for that rich discussion. Do you have any last thoughts for our listeners, and how can they learn more about mindful self-compassion, you and your work?
Yeah, I would just add that self-compassion can be, as, like I said, as simple as a breath. What we call behavioral self-compassion is identifying the things that you do to comfort and soothe yourself, or to strengthen and encourage yourself, because self-compassion isn't just all soft and warm and fuzzy. It's also tapping into this, what Kristin Neff would call fierce self-compassion, standing up for yourself, saying no when you need to say no. Those are all acts of self-compassion and may be on the list of things to answer, what do I need in that moment? So that's one piece of it. Learning more about self-compassion, course, I love my own book, but the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion is the place to go for virtually anything related to self-compassion training, becoming a teacher, all sorts of great meditations and programs and workshops and things. It's centerformsc.org. And Kristin Neff's website, which you will find if you Google self-compassion, selfcompassion.org, is great for those of you who really want to jump into the research. She has an extensive bibliography there of all the publications, relevant publications related to research on self-compassion, and the PDFs are largely there. So if you want to geek out on studies on self-compassion, that's where you could find it.
Thank you so much. Stay on after the sound of the singing bowl for our mindful moment offering. For more mindfulness resources, please join us at mindfulhealthcarecollective.com, where we continue to provide free weekly wellness offerings. We'll also include in the show notes all of the references that Steve just mentioned. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share, leave us stars and reviews. We thank you.
As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or up-level your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely.
So there's a simple, powerful practice from the Mindful Self-Compassion program that is quite portable and accessible, and I strongly encourage you to consider practicing this. You can do this on your own if you just want to try it out when nothing in particular is going on, but it's really intended for when you encounter difficulty, when you notice in a moment that you're suffering. So, and suffering doesn't have to be major, it can be just stress. So just taking a moment now, because we can, to just drop into this present moment and to just notice what's here. In the self-compassion break, maybe you'll, have just had a difficult conversation, or something uncomfortable has happened, or maybe you're feeling some pain or sadness or anger. So just checking in and feeling what's here. So if you call to mind something difficult, what do you notice? See if you can feel your way into this difficult situation. What are you thinking? What emotion is present? What are you feeling in the body? And then just saying to yourself slowly and clearly, this is a moment of suffering. This is mindfulness. So another option would be simply, ouch, this hurts, this sucks. This is the mindfulness. And then as you sort of mentally step back just a bit, saying to yourself slowly and clearly, oh, but suffering is a part of living. This is actually a part of being human. This is what we would call common humanity. Just in that moment, recognizing that every human being suffers. You might say to yourself, I'm not alone, or me too. It's good to remember that suffering is universal, but not equal across individuals and groups. When we say common humanity, we're not equating one person's suffering to another. Just see if you can connect with the feeling of struggle or suffering, and notice that This is something that every human being feels in one form or another. And then if you'd like, just to remind yourself of the capacity we have to be kind to ourselves, you might place your hand over your heart or some other place on the body that feels soothing or supportive, maybe on the cheek or on the belly, maybe holding your own hand, and just saying, may I be kind to myself. In this moment, letting go of needing to change anything about the situation, could I just be kind to myself? This is the self-kindness of self-compassion. May I give myself what I need? We can even ask ourselves in this moment, what do I need just now? Maybe I just need a moment of quiet. Maybe it's a breath. Maybe it's to step out of the situation. Maybe it's to say something comforting to myself, like, oh, this is hard. You can do this. It can be kind, warm, tender self-compassion. May I accept myself just as I am? Or it could be stronger, fierce compassion. Like, no, I won't allow myself to be harmed in this way. May I have the courage and strength to make a change. And if you have any trouble finding just the right words to say to yourself, you might call to mind what a dear friend would say to you in this situation. What would you say to someone who was struggling with a situation like this? And then offer those same words to yourself. So mindfulness, this is a moment of suffering. Common humanity, suffering is a part of life. And self-kindness, may I be kind to myself. May I give myself what I need. This is a self-compassion break. You do this in 10 seconds or 10 minutes. It's a portable practice you can take with you and practice whenever you encounter difficulty.